and also the head of the pediatric transplant unit. He has done many successful renal transplants in Rainbow Children's Hospital. He has also runs a program of pediatric nephrology fellowships, and he's an excellent speaker and orator, and has given a number of talks on pediatric nephrology and neonatal nephrology. And I have known Saumil Gaur since 2013, and I have heard a lot of talks of him. He has done many of. You can go ahead, Saumil.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Srinivas, and the team, and it's a pleasure for me to be here in front of all of you, especially my neonatal colleagues, whom I also keep interacting in our center, and where we get into the renal issues in the newborns, which do happen quite often and common. So, it was an interesting topic when Dr. Srinivas spoke to me about discussion on neonatal hypertension, and I was debating in my mind how to bring it forward from an angle, from the perspective of a nephrologist or a perspective of a neonatologist. And then I think the going forward way was that I try to combine both of them together and try to bring a little bit of nephrology, a little bit of neonatology, and then arrive at a common conscience. Um, the outline of the discussion would be simple. It would be more practical oriented, and like the case-to-case scenarios which you all us and we all see together in our NICUs for preterms and for preterm and term babies. And I've tried to keep the slides very simple and without putting too much of the database. So the learning objectives of our study would be we'll try to identify the neonates which are at risk, and try to identify what is hypertension, recognize hypertension, learn how to evaluate them, and also what are the treatment choices which the current medical standards offer to us. With these simple objects, let's go ahead with the case one. Now, there is a 6-week-old former 28-week gestational infant, which is being cared for in the neonatal intensive care unit, where he is completing treatment for pneumonia and is working towards gaining weight to be discharged home. It's like in a feeder and grower category right now, but had been extremely 28 weeks earlier. While reviewing the infant's chart, you notice blood pressure readings of 98 by 68, 105 by 70, and somewhere around 96 by 74 over the last 24 hours. What is the assessment of infant in our minds? A common situation you would all be facing. Let's try to answer this question by looking at the concept of neonatal hypertension as we go forward. So let's understand how do we measure, how do we define, and how do we diagnose neonatal hypertension. So the techniques are three, very simple: invasive, non-invasive, and among non-invasive, most common one is oscillometry. Gold standard is invasive arterial BP, where we obtain the BP using an umbilical arterial line or a peripheral arterial line, and is directly indicated for a sick newborn who is on multiple inotropes and who is extremely sick. Non-invasive BP monitoring in newborns come with in the form of sphygmomanometry and ultrasound Doppler, and they have their limitations. It is virtually impossible to do sphygmomanometry in an extremely preterm baby, especially around 28 weeks, 29, 30 weeks. Even ultrasound Doppler requires a lot of skills, but still we have many data. Many of our even charts, BP charts, which we follow are made up on ultrasound Doppler studies. So they are known to underestimate the BP, and hence they have their limitations. So in the midway between these two, invasive and between invasive arterial BP versus sphygmomanometry, we have oscillometry. And oscillometric is what we use on day-to-day basis, which is more practical, reliable, and it is relatively closer to invasive, but it tends to overestimate the blood pressure in sick babies, where it's better to go ahead with the invasive arterial BP. So when we do the BP monitoring or checking, first we need to know what is the correct situation or the status of the newborn at which the obtained BP has its clear-cut meaning and it is reliable. We have a Novanco protocol which is freely available on web, and especially the training students should know what is Novanco protocol of BP measurements. So the baby should be can be either in prone or supine position. It doesn't matter. Suppose you are ventilating the baby or you have kept the baby in a prone position for the feeding and all that, there's no problem. Device type, usually we prefer oscillometric devices with appropriate size cuff, and the cuff should be satisfying the criteria where width to arm circumference should be somewhere between 0.4 to 0.45 to 0.7. Cuff location should be the right upper forearm, and the timing should be that the baby should be asleep, or if awake should be quiet. We should ensure that the baby is not disturbed for at least 15 minutes after the cuff is placed. And the feeding or medical intervention should have at least, there should be a gap of 1.5 hours before the BP measurement. That middle point is very important, that the cuff should stay for a considerable time, like 10 to 15 minutes. And the reason being that many times in haste, our nurses or we doctors will tie the cuff and immediately we'll press it and start squeezing the arm. Because while tying, the baby is little agitated, and that can also give rise to the unreliable measurement. So tie it, let the baby calm down, and then measure the blood pressure. And the number of BP recordings should be at least 3, maybe 2 minutes apart. Then we go ahead to define what is elevated blood pressure. So actually there are no specific definitions which are being researched and invented in newborns, but what we have done is we have just extrapolated or taken from what we do for the pediatric age group, where systolic and/or diastolic BP readings on 3 separate occasions are over and above the 95th percentile for the post-conception age is defined as hypertension. So we have the relevant charts for that on which we should plot them. For preterms, we have the charts which are available in pediatric 12 particular journal, where they have used oscillometric plus Doppler technique, and they have rolled out the chart from 26 weeks onward, and we don't have BP charts below 26 weeks at present. And for the term babies, we have oscillometric data based on Doppler, which was published in 1987, I mean, way back, 30 years back almost. And it was called as a second report on hypertension. Right now, we have 4th report rolled out, but still we are using the same charts. And we have oscillometric data, which is a pooled data available, which is better than the Doppler chart, Doppler-based chart, which was available in 1987. If you see, in our case, this child's blood pressures were clearly above the 95th, even 99th centile, by 90/60. So maybe he's not having classical hypertension. Sensing going forward in the next 2 or 3 days, we should start seeing the BP a little bit more carefully and closely, so that we don't miss out high blood pressures in this child before this child goes back. So having understood this, we move on to case 2. And case 2 is that is a 36-week gestational infant which is admitted in an ICU because of mild respiratory distress. Serial antenatal ultrasounds had demonstrated a large cystic structure in the left renal fossa, but no other abnormalities. The infant's BPs have been ranging from 95 to 60 or 118/78 even while sleeping. So what would be the most likely causes or the cause of the infant's elevated BP? And this brings us to understand that how many of the kids would be having, or neonates would be having, blood pressures. And also let's try to understand the prevalence of elevated blood pressures in our neonatology, in our NICUs. So we have enough data, and a lot of studies have happened in different NICUs, unicentric and multicentric. The consensus is that we have observed around 0.2 to 0.3% of term NICU graduates have elevated blood pressures or hypertension. And 1 to 1.3% preterms were found to be having high blood pressures, especially more of single-centric studies when one or two multicentric studies were there. An interesting thing was that when some of these NICU graduates were analyzed for 6 weeks in the follow-up by Friedman and et al., they found that the prevalence had gone up to around 2.6%. And they found that there was a direct correlation between the low APGARs in these babies versus, and they had prolonged an ICU stay, which was having a significant correlation. So then in Pediatrics 2017, some recommendations were rolled out which say that all the babies who had had a prolonged NICU stay with low APGARs and all should be recommended for BP monitoring going forward when they visit the postnatal clinics. So what are the surrogate settings which makes a neonatologist think that you may be dealing with hypertension or your baby may go on to develop high blood pressure going forward, apart from the other conditions which you are dealing, like sepsis, like the lung issues, and all sorts of turbulence which NICU, a typical neonate would have in the NICU. So prematurity and LBW, being premature and LBW itself predispose them to be hypertensive, and there is enough data to talk about that. I have not put those data, those graphs and all the various curves because I want to keep it very practical this particular session. USC placements is very important, and it was found out that 25% of kids who had newborns who had USC in situ went on to develop small thrombi, and that led to the development of hypertension. Maternal factors like BMI more than 30, and hypertensive mother who may or may not be having HELLP syndrome, who was on substance abuse, or some very rarely if mother had maternal placental cholangioma, they can have high blood pressures. Very common situation, bronchopulmonary dysplasia, that also predisposes the newborns to high blood, or neonates, preterm neonates to high blood pressure, and the variability can range from 13 to 43% as published in new reviews 2007. Now, very interesting is these post-abdominal operative abdominal surgeries like gastroschisis, phalloceles, and all that. And you would be surprised that 30 to 50, and even some studies, they have quoted up till 80% of these babies are having high blood pressures. So what makes them hypertensive? And still the mechanism is not very clear, but intra-abdominal issues gives rise to altered renal blood flow, and that gives rise to a mild aldosterone elevation. Along with that, they were found to be having excessive catecholamines in their bloodstream, and that's why they were found to be hypertensive. So always be careful when we are dealing with in regard to hypertension. If you are having a child who is a case of gastroschisis and all, or who is going to get treated for intra-abdominal surgeries. Then medications like dexamethasone or steroids offered to mother, or the baby has received steroids, or caffeine has been offered. Prolonged pancuronium usage and TPN also predispose such babies for hypertension. Then pain. Newborn who is in perpetual pain will keep his blood pressures elevated. Seizures, raised intracranial hypertension, they are all predisposes. Very rarely a genetic phenotype of cytochrome P450 CC phenotype, very rarely, is known to predispose the newborns for hypertension. And ECMO, which is the more regularly and commonly done in West, because of the altered renal flow, can predispose them to the hypertension. So which brings us to the straightforward causes apart from the settings, like cardiac causes, endocrine causes, and renal causes. Among the cardiac causes, we should always think of coarctation of aorta or aorta-related issues, when we are dealing with a newborn who is hypertension, with interrupted aortic arch, and sometimes very simple fluid overload. And if suppose we have unknowingly there's a fluid excess in the body, that can put them into hypertension. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia, hyperaldosteronism, hyperthyroidism, adrenal hemorrhage, and hypercalcemia, especially like in Williams syndrome, can also cause hypertension in newborns. And among the renal, which is actually more common, we have renal artery thrombosis, particularly if they have a USC or who had a USC earlier. Renal vein thrombosis, which presents with flank pain, a flank mass with hematuria and hypertension should be thought of an RBT when we are dealing with a newborn with hypertension. Renal artery stenosis or compression on the artery or the vessels from an external tumor like neuroblastoma can give rise to hypertension. Parenchymal renal diseases like even simple acute tubular necrosis, AKI, renal dysplasia, because the dysplastic tissue could be a site of excessive renin-aldosterone secretion and gives rise to hypertension. And cystic diseases on newborns like autosomal recessive polycystic kidney disease or PKD of infantile or neonatal onset or cause hypertension. Very, very important, severely obstructed urinary tract. When I say severely obstructed urinary tract, I mean like posterior urethral valve. Sometimes you may have a PUJ obstruction, unilateral or bilateral. Sometimes you may have bilateral VUJ obstruction also, which can give rise to this. And PUV, as we know, is more common than all of the above. It should be suspected if you are having, especially a male child, and you have hydronephrosis in the kidney in the ultrasound. That would be the cause of the hypertension. A special mention about the umbilical artery catheter, which is day in and day out being put in an ICU, because it was found in a lot of studies that around 25% of babies who had a UAC had some thrombus. But please beware that you may get the Doppler done, but still those thrombi may not be visible in the Doppler with the best of the radiologists. So still you cannot rule out a small thrombus formation in the umbilical artery catheter, which can give rise to hypertension. Why does it cause hypertension? What could be the mechanism? The mechanism is disruption of the vascular endothelium when the catheter is inserted, and this shearing or disruption can give rise to thrombi. This thrombi will get dislodged and give rise to a small renal, micro dispatch of thrombi in the kidney and give rise to elevation of the renal aldosterone and give rise to salt and water retention and give rise to the hypertension. And it was very clear that it correlated with the longer duration of the UAC. The more longer was the UAC kept, the more were the chances of developing hypertension. But there was no correlation with the position like high or low UAC, and that was clearly sorted out by this good, interesting Cochrane meta-analysis, where they found no correlation. Please remember, think of elevated blood pressure in a baby if you have UAC catheter. That brings us to the case 3. That with each case we'll try to learn more and more about neonatal hypertension. That's how I have planned these small slides. So there's a term neonate which is transported to your hospitals and ICU from an outside facility for evaluation and management of severe congestive heart failure, CHF. After initial stabilization, the infant's BPs are noted to be as high as 125/85 and none below 100/68. You get an urgent page from the attending cardiologist who thought there was something abnormal with the kidneys when she was performing a bedside echocardiogram. What studies should be done to further evaluate the infant's hypertension? Interesting. So let's try to go through the process of history taking and evaluation. What are the investigation order? So to get to the bottom of the cause of it. So history taking should, as I mentioned earlier, involve maternal history of steroids intake, cocaine or substance abuse and heroin, maternal hypertension, diabetes, maternal obesity. Prenatal oligoamnios should never be missed. So prenatal oligoamnios means that you would be having a pre-existing renal anomaly, abnormality which has just manifested as hypertension. Polyhydramnios, like as I was talking about omphalocele and gastroschisis, they can have polyhydramnios and also they can give us renal anomalies which were pre-detected in anomaly scans or prenatal ultrasounds should be probed. Postnatal medications administered to infants like adrenergic agonists, indomethacin, caffeine, and steroid, they all predispose to hypertension. And again, please never forget history of umbilical catheterization. And what investigation we are going to ask? We'll ask for a urine analysis to look for RBCs, especially if you are suspecting hematuria. You look for proteinuria. You never know that you are having some congenital form of nephrotic syndrome which can present with hypertension. Electrolytes should be always checked because there is a condition known as monogenic hypertension. Monogenic hypertension is when you have issues with the single gene defect, and just like examples are Gordon syndrome, Liddle syndrome, apparent mineralocorticoid excess. So they will have usually hypokalemia. Their renin levels will be lower, will be normal or low, and they have good hypertension. Usually it presents more in the early childhood, but sometimes they can really present. And elevated potassium, you should think of possibility of Gordon's versus you can think of renal dysfunction. Hypercalcemia comes close to hypertension, especially if you look at a possibility of Williams syndrome. Blood urea nitrogen and creatinine, no doubt about this. You have to do it in any child with. Just be careful about the maternal reflections of the elevated urea. Additional investigations, which help also are endocrines like thyroid study should be done. T3, T4, TSH should never be forgotten, although it is now regular practice to do TFTs in newborns. Plasma renin activity and aldosterone, but please understand, plasma renin is usually naturally elevated in newborns. So you have to accept with a pinch of salt. Cortisol levels and workup for congenital hereditary hyperplasia in the form of deoxycorticosterone level on 17 OHP levels. And if you are suspecting malignancies, you can think for plasma and urine catecholamines, metanephrines, or normetanephrines like neuroblastoma and should be. And when you are examining such child, and weight trends, every day you have to make sure that the weight you are looking at volume matches, as I mentioned earlier. High volume in the body itself can make them hypertensive. Head-to-toe examination, dysmorphic features should be looked for, like external ear abnormalities, preauricular pits, etc., or single umbilical artery. Especially if you are looking at something like Bohr syndrome. Bohr syndrome is bronchio-otorenal syndrome. Cardiovascular examination should be very detailed. Look for the four extremity blood pressures, murmurs, and feel the pulses, femoral and radial and brachial pulses. Examination of genitourinary and the renal are very important. Feel for the kidneys, especially the renomegaly. You may have cystic diseases of the like autosomal recessive cystic kidney disease, or cystic dysplasia of the kidney, or multicystic dysplastic kidney, which is bigger in size, can be felt, or renal vein thrombosis, RVT, they can present with renomegaly. Abdominal wall anomalies, I mentioned gastroschisis and all. Bruise, especially if you are looking at thinking of renal artery stenosis, then you should think of possibilities of bruise also. And genitalia should always be examined, especially if you are suspecting congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And brings us to the imaging. How do we image such children? What are the battery of radiological investigation which we can use? It all begins with a simple ultrasound and a Doppler. Ultrasound for the kidneys, for the corticomedullary differentiation should be asked from the radiologist. Look at the cystic changes in the kidney. Look at the sizes of the kidney. Anyone, one kidney is big or small. Small kidney more toward dysplasia kidney and all should be clearly taken care of. Doppler is very important, which will show, especially the large vessels like aorta, where if the aorta is having any narrowing or if there is any mid-aortic syndrome, any thrombus is sitting in the large aorta, so should be picked up. Now, Doppler is not excellent investigation to rule out RAS. Even if your Doppler is normal, it does not conclude that you cannot rule out renal artery stenosis because of the very thin vasculature, and babies will never cooperate. Usually, to check the pulse velocity for the radiologist in the Doppler, it's virtually impossible to them. So, broadly, they can be used as a screening tool, but not as a diagnostic tool. Very important in the next line would be a CT angiogram if you're very, very worried, or if you see that one of the kidneys small inside and size, and you suspect RAS on that side, renal artery stenosis, then a CT angiogram is again a good evaluation for such a scenario. But again, CT angiogram is a high-level screening test. It will not conclude that you are having a renal artery stenosis. Then what proves a renal artery stenosis? It is actually conventional angiography or arteriography, which is done by a cardiologist in the cath lab, who can show by injecting the dye that there is a some level of renal artery stenosis because of fibromuscular dysplasia. The child should be posted for this invasive procedure only if you are planning a therapeutic intervention, because in the same setting they have two options. If suppose they see the ostia of the renal artery is the one which is smaller and obliterated because of fibromuscular dysplasia, they can put a balloon and they can dilate it, right? Otherwise, and sometimes they can use a cut balloon, and that cut balloon can also scrape the fibromuscular dysplastic tissue and move through it. This requires very high level of expertise in a center which is capable of doing this, and not very easy to find and into in medium cities. And then comes important one which will be the micturating cystourethrogram or PCOG, especially if you are suspecting an obstructed urinary tract, like you're suspecting reflux, or posterior urethral valve is the one which is an emergency should be done. And then comes your nuclear medicine studies like DMSA scan, which will pick up a tissue or the area in the kidney which is dysplastic, which is giving rise to excessive renin secretion, or any scarred area because of any UTI which has happened in the neonatal period, and that gives rise to scarring and gives rise to pyelonephritic scarring and gives rise to high blood pressures. Goes without saying, echocardiogram is mandatory to rule out coarctation of aorta and all the cardiac anomalies which can give rise. So as I just mentioned, conventional angiography is actually most informative and therapeutic if you are suspecting a renal artery. That brings us to the case 4, where you are. So we have learned now what is hypertension in newborns. We have learned what is the setting, causes, and we have learned how we evaluate. And now we are going to the next part with how you are going to treat a newborn with hypertension. You are consulted by NICU to see a 2-month-old, 26-week infant. Now, this is for me as a nephrologist that I'm being called in 26-week infant with bronchopulmonary dysplasia who remains on supplemental oxygen. Over the last 2-3 weeks, the NICU team has noted that the infant's BP have been mostly around 100/65, and none of them 5/55. The infant's workup included laboratory evaluation showing normal kidney function and imaging, including echocardiogram and renal ultrasound, and does not demonstrate any other etiology of hypertension. What should be done to manage the infant's hypertension? So, we should try to understand the broad treatment outlines for neonatal hypertension, and a little bit of comparison we can draw from the pediatric hypertension compared to newborn as we go forward. First thing is, in pediatric hypertension, we usually advise non-pharmacological therapy if we don't find any underlying, cardiovascular, renal, or endocrine cause. Considered could be essential hypertension, and we tell you start non-pharmacological. In newborns or in neonates, there is no non-pharmacological therapy. First step is we forget that, and if we have to treat, we have to treat with our pharmacological agents. Next step is we confirm elevated blood pressure. As we mentioned above, we have to ensure over multiple settings that yes, there is significant hypertension and we have to treat this. We identify and rectify all the iatrogenic causes like various medications I mentioned above earlier. We treat the pain, the settings like pain, hypoxemia, especially if you are having bronchopulmonary dysplasia, chronic lung disease children, hormone disorders, as I mentioned earlier, and then we identify the candidates or the kids who really require antihypertensive therapy. Usually, it's better to team up with cardiologists and pediatric nephrologists once you enter the situation when you have corrected iatrogenic factors, pain, hypoxemia, hormone disorders, and all that. Then we go into the next. What are the challenges when we start treating them? See, there are no defined clinical criteria for initiation of therapy. There is no single number which says, okay, this is a cutoff, like you have in, like it's still a debate in hypoglycemia in newborns. What is that number in which you treat hypoglycemia? Same way, what is that number when you start treating the hypertension? There's no single defined clinical criteria, but we have understood that anything more than 95 to 96, 99 centile post-conceptual age for the sex, we start treating them. There are no long-term studies who have studied the outcome of chronic hypertension in neonatal period. That's also very important. And so we don't know if child who has been who had been hypertensive in neonatal period, whether this child starts developing early adult onset hypertension. We really don't. So how much to treat, how long to treat, and why to treat at all? These are the questions. But if you have a child who has congestive cardiac failure coming to your this thing, there's no confusion. There are no RCTs on any antihypertensive drugs in neonates. That's the big lacune in the modern medical science. There is lack of robust normative data also, because we still don't have unknown BP threshold values to initiate. So finally, it boils down to clinical expertise and which guides the decision making, like just we do for hypertension. So let's try to understand the severe case, like I was talking about congestive cardiac failure. So acute severe hypertension, is the one where we are going to discuss now. So we were calling it earlier as hypertensive emergency, which is equivalent of acute severe hypertension, which is nothing but hypertension with evidence of target or organ damage like cardiac, renal, or eyes, or the brain, four organs. First thing is, when you have acute severe hypertension, institute and intra-arterial BP monitoring. These are sick units. They are in danger. Please put a line, arterial line, and start taking the BP. Immediately evaluate for target organ damage like cardiovascular and renal. We start the treatment with a broad understanding that we will not lead to rapid reduction of blood pressure, especially in primaries, because that can lead to IVH because of the fragility of the vessels of the brain. We usually choose to start with continuous IV antihypertensives compared to oral antihypertensives. And the choices of continuous IV antihypertensives are nicardipine, IV labetalol, IV esmolol, and IV SN. Of them, unfortunately, nicardipine is not available in our country. So we end up using labetalol oblique sodium nitroprusside in extreme cases as a continuous. Advantage of IV antihypertensives is they can be easily titrated. You stop within a minute, the effect will disappear because they have very short half-lives, and that is the advantage. You will get restore the normalcy if you feel the blood pressures are getting lower. Suppose we have mild to moderate hypertension, then you can choose to treat with some target organ damage. Then you can choose to treat with intermittent IV or even oral antihypertensives, and the choices would be labetalol and hydrolase. This is a table which mentions some IV medications among the groups, like calcium channel blockers, nicardipine, beta blockers, like esmolol, and propranolol. Again, IV propranolol is not available. However, I would be careful in suggesting beta blockers if I'm dealing with a child who has bronchopulmonary dysplasia, who is having wheezing issues, who has a lot of bronchospasm, and especially who has some AKI. Vasodilators are extremely good, like SNP and hydralazine. SNP is sodium nitroprusside, and the range is 0.1 to 10, but they can cause renal failure and thiocyanate poisoning, especially if you're using sodium nitroprusside. Hydralazine is quite safer, but I don't think IV hydralazine is also available. ACE inhibitors like IV enalaprate not available and very risky to use, especially in very preterms, because it interferes with nephronogenesis. ACE inhibitors can lead to hyperkalemia, creatinine will increase, AKI can happen. And beta blockers like labetalol, a combination of alpha and beta blockers, alpha and beta blockers like labetalol is useful, which is freely available, but to be avoided if CCF. Now comes the stable infarct with moderate hypertension. In this, you have a situation, you have choice of treating with oral medications like calcium channel blockers, like istradipine, not available freely, but amlodipine or even ifedipine can be used. They're slow in action, but sustained action and takes time to act. Beta blockers like propranolol can be used, but to be avoided in bronchopulmonary dysplasia or chronic lung disease, as I mentioned earlier. They can worsening of spasm. In this situation, diuretics are more useful, especially hydrochlorothiazide or spironolactone. By removing the water, makes the lung happy and also reduce the blood pressure. ACE inhibitors to be used with care if you at all you're using, because they interfere with nephronogenesis till 44 weeks post-menstrual age. And because the nephronogenesis keeps continuing till 44 weeks post-menstrual age, and that can predispose them to be having low nephronal mass, and that can give rise to the hypertension. That can lead to hyperkalemia, even creatinine elevation, and severe hypertension. And other options are like clonidine and prazosin, which are promising and to be used with very care. Clonidine is used for prazosin. We still are not there clear about its utility. Now comes to the non-pharmacological methods like surgical options. Surgical options are reserved for very few situations, like if you have coarctation of aorta or severe RAS, which is amenable to be repaired in a infant. How impossible to repair RAS in a very small baby, especially preterms, and term baby of a considerable weight and where the probes can go through are only repaired. Um, uh, Now, neuroblastoma is a situation where if you have hypertension directly, if you go for surgical excision, it helps. And if suppose you have multicystic dysplastic kidney, which is coming with hypertension and pouring a lot of renin in the system along with, or there is a severe RAS, which is not amenable to repair, making the life difficult, then you can go for a urinary. Right? So, long-term outcomes are the ones which we need to understand that there is still positive of data, as I mentioned earlier. What is the final outcome? But reasonable, good observed long-term outcome are there depending on the cause. So, if suppose you have the cause like transient blood pressures would be seen only in the first 4 to 6 weeks if it was secondary to umbilical artery catheter or uh, you know uh, So, so umbilical artery.
So, Somil,
Yes,
there is some
yes.
disturbance in the background. Can you repeat it actually, the slide?
You're talking. Which one? This one, Dr. Srinivas?
Yes, 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 yes. Yes, yes.
Long-term
This one.
outcomes. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So there is positive data, but reasonable, good observed long-term outcomes have been shown by in certain situations, like if you have transient elevated blood pressure when you had USC or BPD was as a setting which caused to this, and most of the times in the next 4 to 6 weeks after they are out of these settings, the blood pressure normalizes and you are out of the pharmacotherapy. However, beyond the neonatal period, it has persisted if you have RAS, self-respiratory underlying dysplasia. CACOT is congenital anomalies of kidney and urinary tract like PUV and all. So PUV, even if you have cleared, can make them hypertensive for their entire childhood or even lifetime. CKD, if they are born with neonatal poor nephronal reserve, they can have CKD, and even coarctation of aorta, which has been repaired, they still can be hypertensive for long. So in such scenario, it is better to advise such families to continue home oscillometric BP recordings, and they have been found to be useful and give us a good idea of going forward and titrating the antihypertensive therapy. And yes, these are the kids, if they remain to be hypertensive beyond a 3 to 4 months period, who require a periodic follow-up for target end organ damage, which is TOD, renal function, and even the renal scans to see how is the kidney growing, how is the nephronogenesis, especially if you had a very extremely preterm baby who was of around 26. So uh, finally, that brings me to after 45 minutes, brings me to the last slide, which it must be sensed as a comorbid, not when we are looking at the other situations and try to treat this also like we are treating the other comorbid situations. Right? Common associations are USC and bronchopulmonary dysplasia. Measurement of BP is challenging, but it is worthy. We should take, try to get as close as possible, get as good number, as accurate number which you can. And detailed evaluation would usually reveal the cause in newborns. Unlike teenagers or the pediatric cases where I end up sometimes evaluating deep and found out that they are having essential hypertension. Antihypertensive therapy is considered can be considered early if you are having a sick neonate and is guided by the severity and the underlying hemodynamic status. Most infants would resolve their hypertension within the 6 months of 6 months of starting the treatment, and regular renal follow-up would be very prudent in such scenarios. Like you do a detailed follow-up for a neurodevelopmental outcome of all the preterms. I think kidney also needs the due going forward, where it is a neglected organ, and many times I see these kids in the childhood period, if they had a stormy neonatal course, which turned out to be CKD, and then it's a heartbreaking at that time. So finish my session. Thank you so much for patient hearing, and I would just like to sensitize the fellow audiences, esteemed audience who are there, that